So let's write a test here for io.js, and for this I'll add a io.test.js file. And here we can import it from vtest as we did it before. We can also already import expect because we'll need that as well. And then we can write our test here. And I want to write a test for the write data function, and I want to test the main thing it should do. It in the end should execute this write file method. It should save that data to a file. So here I will say it should execute the write file method. And then here in this test, I want to execute the write data function, which is imported from IO. And we need some test data. So here I'll create my test data and I'll just say test. And then to write data, we pass that test data. And we also need a file name. So I'll add my test file name, which is test.txt, let's say. And I'll also provide this test file name. Okay. So that would execute write data. How can we now test whether it succeeded? How can we now test whether the write file method was called? Well, it turns out that we can do this, but right now we don't know yet how that works. So what I want to do instead is, I know that write file yields a promise, and if that promise is not rejected, if it resolves instead, I know that it was successful, which implicitly tells me that write file was called and worked. So what we can do here is we can use expect and wrap write data with it, and then use resolves. And then I want to make sure that this worked. So we need some to-be method here. And now it really depends on what write file returns in the end, if it resolves, so to which value that promise resolves. And it turns out that it doesn't resolve to any value at all, but the important thing is that it does resolve at all. It's not rejected. So therefore here, I basically just want to check that it's resolved, and then I expect the value to which it resolved to be undefined, because we won't get any value, but we also wouldn't make it here if this would be rejected for some reason. Now, we can return this here to make sure that vtest or also just waits until this is done, so that we really evaluate this. And with that, we can now run npm test. I will quickly add --run here to only run it once instead of entering watch mode. And then if we run npm test, this gets executed and it passes. Now, just to show you that I did set this all up correctly, if we remove the data folder and therefore it doesn't find a data folder, if I now run this again, it fails because now this promise was rejected instead of resolving, because write file saved because the folder to which it wanted to write doesn't exist. So I'll re-add it here, but that is something that shows us that this really works. And with the folder re-added, it works again. So what's the problem with that? Which problem are we facing here? Our test works, and you might be fine with this setup, but there is one disadvantage. Whenever we run this test, we do in the end write to the file system and we do create this test.txt file. Now, again, that's not necessarily a problem, but often it is. Our test here has a side effect. It writes data to the hard drive. Now, writing data might be acceptable, but it also might not be, because maybe you're replacing data that shouldn't be replaced. But especially if you think about erasing data or anything like this, we could face problems if our tests really do that. You could clash with actual data that should not be deleted. You could accidentally delete production data or live data. And you don't just face this problem when using file system methods like writing or deleting files. You also have very similar problems if you think about sending HTTP requests to backend APIs or working with databases or anything like this. All these things are side effects because you interact with some other system. You have an external dependency, you could say. You're interacting with the hard drive, you're interacting with a database, you are interacting with something else outside of your program and outside of your code. And that is such a side effect. Again, maybe you're fine with this, but typically when writing tests, you want to avoid that so that you don't accidentally change or delete production data, or you insert data into a production database, or you clutter up your local file system, or you have a test that tests whether a file is removed successfully and it fails because the file doesn't exist. Anything like this, you don't really want to do that. Because we don't want to test whether writing a file to the system works. It should work, of course, because write file is a method that's provided by Node.js. It's their responsibility to make sure that this works. We want to test how our code works with that function. We want to test if our code does its job. And here this would mean that we might be interested in whether write file was called successfully. We might be interested in the data that we passed to write file, if that got forwarded correctly, but we're not interested in learning whether a file is actually written to the file system. Because that's not our code that's doing that. That's a third-party code that's doing it. So therefore, we often want to get rid of such side effects because it has various disadvantages and you typically don't want to trigger them, therefore. So how can we now get rid of these side effects?